How are you? Good
I'm
morning.
good. I'm It's nice to see you.
We're going to do a kind of a different podcast episode than I usually do. I didn't have to read a whole book, which is
You're
nice.
welcome.
I didn't have to power read through a book before my deadline. But you did come to me. It feels like it's going to be maybe like a bit of a dear prudence for small businesses, global businesses, in a good way. In a good way, I promise you. Um, because you came to me with this, hey, like we should talk about how small businesses are managing this crazy time that we're in and this whole new world of work, which I feel like has been talked about a lot from the perspective of workers and like how the wonderful world of remote and how nobody wants to go back to the office. Um, and somewhat from the perspective of the big employers with a lot of money who can, uh, do a lot of things to attract people back in the office or to adapt. But we haven't talked so much about small businesses. And that's where you come in. Maybe let's start with you introducing yourself and telling us what your business is.
Yeah. I'm Ariane Bernard, and I am right now the CEO of a little company called Helio Cloud. And Helio Cloud was born during the pandemic. She was an incubated project at an incubator in London called Founders Factory, venture backed by GMG Ventures, which is the Guardian, and went through her incubator and now is in the accelerator, not ever having a little bit like those babies, right? That only knows the world through the prism of can't meet real people, does not have a real location, even if she wanted. And and it's interesting because I think a lot of young companies like mine start remote anyway when they're doing software. With the understanding that you can lean on the real world, meeting people in real life, maybe hiring a hybrid offshore onshore team. And what I found was building a brand new company and therefore a brand new team, especially a very lean team as these incubated startups are, really was kind of opened up a whole other level of what it meant um, to onboard and to create culture and create alignment around the strategy of both the product and the business, that I've found very challenging.
Mm. I love that your business is a she, by the way.
He is a she. She is a she. The world has plenty of natural he's and it's, but I yeah.
I like that. I like that. I think it gives a different tone to the business for sure. So you're experienced in product strategy, business strategy, and management, but this is your first entrepreneurial adventure, isn't it? As
I am a
well.
first time CEO. Just as Helio is a baby company, I too am a baby CEO, and I do have extensive experience with, as you said, with building teams or building products in the corporate world. But of course, the big difference, which I think is readily obvious to anyone, is whenever you're building even something new within an existing organization, you new is not quite like new from scratch, and there's also new, well resourced and moneyed versus new scrappy and lean. And so my experience, I worked for 14 years at the New York Times, building a lot of publishing systems, among other things, a lot of delivery platforms in general, and worked at Taboola, which is an ad tech company, which is quite global in its nature, but was already 700 people deep when I showed up. So it was a 10-year-old startup with 700 people, a startup definitely in sort of its spirit, but in all other ways, an established company with everything it needed, and already quite successful. I worked as the chief digital officer of Le Parisien, which is a French media company, a legacy media company, owned by LVMH, also been around for years and years and backed by LVMH, which provides a lot of corporate structure in all kinds of different ways.
Yeah, in the good and the bad.
Well, in ways I had not seen before, and in ways that are actually quite comfortable. It's very comfortable to work within a company like LVMH, certainly. But when you do new things in an environment like that, new is a very relative term. So with Helio, I am discovering true from scratch everything, from scratch as a product, from scratch as a business, from scratch as an organization, which is really interesting, but does mean that every single thing needs to be figured out, for better for worse.
Yeah, I'm with you on the starting a business mid-pandemic
Right.
craziness. I can relate. So how has it been different or been challenging, more so than what you would have already expected from launching a brand new
Yeah.
business, by the fact that, we're living in this very remote world?
I think the two things that I really didn't um, imagine would be so impactful was the fact that because we've been doing, there is having a remote workplace that has a place that they call the office, right? And I had worked with um, in at Taboola, my dev team, for instance, my engineering team work was in LA. I was in New York. My boss was in Israel, and I would spend a week a month in LA, and the rest of the time would go on daily calls with them to kind of get the lay of the land. But they were in an office, so there was a centeredness, and I was in an office too. There was a centeredness to the experience of we were at the office in separate offices, right? I've also worked with offshore teams that were working in a much more traditional offshore kind of scenario at the New York Times, you know, doing certain kinds of work with us. And we connected at weird hours, and but again, they were within a corporate environment or an office environment. Everyone, understandably, I think, went through this pandemic, whether they were based in India, in Vietnam, in London, or New York, with their own lives being upended in some fashion, whether that's kids or just so many dimension or just social isolation or so. That's a moving piece that I think also affects people's ability to kind of get into that workspace, get into sort of framing it for the long term. I feel like there were many blunders that happened with Helio because things were a little bit too casual. And it's weird to kind of to say that I think it's the environment, but I don't think that the fact that there was no work environment, I think that didn't help. It's you start something kind of looks like a passion project, kind of looks like you have all the time in the world. You don't. The runway's the
Mm,
wrong way, and you're kind of doing it from home the way you would if you're just starting out your new thing. I suspect that it did not help that there was no sort of anchoring of that new company and for the folks working with me, anchoring of that within the context of something that felt and read like work.
mm,
The other thing is really probably more connected with like it's a brand new thing, and you know you hear a lot, of course, people talking about like what's your culture and how do we speak to each other, how do we convey what our goals are, how do we debate what these goals are, how do we hold each other accountable, and how do we support each other, and all that together is culture. Ultimately, it's how we speak about these things. When you're both trying to build a company and build a culture at the same time, which I think is the fact of every new business does that to an extent, right? And you add cultural distance and time zones and not every, these are contractors, some of whom I would like to bring on board sort of more formally, but because very young company, not quite there yet. All these things participate in creating even less alignment, or rather making creating alignment even harder. And so we were talking about this the other day, but one thing that I know I had to really kind of struggle with was making the ask to turn on our cameras. Like that was like a thing for weeks. I would be the only one who would turn on my camera in our daily calls with some of the engineers who work on the project with me, and I'd be the only one who turned on my camera. And I do understand the struggle of many people who are like, I'm on Zoom all day. I can't just be like, asked to just be there in that way all the time. And it's like so demanding. And I get it. In our case, this is an hour and a half a day. So not quite full day. And anyway, it's different to say every now and then I just need to not have a meeting where my camera is turned on for XYZ reason, but default right to turning on this camera. And I realize it's such a small thing, right, to say like it was hard because the camera was turned off, but everything counts. Everything that helps you understand whether people are connecting with a particular goal that you have for that week or that month or whatever, everything that helps you understand, are people, like we're discussing something maybe technical and trying to debate whether to solve this way or that way. I need to make sure, including in your eyes, if I can tell, that we're talking about the same thing, that we're understanding the same thing, and everything counts, because the distance does not help us. I can't lean over your shoulder in 2 hours and look at what you're doing on your screen and be like, that I think we might be doing things differently. There'll be none of that feedback. So you need to take everything that you can have in order to make sure that that what you hear on the line is really how this person feels. Like when they say, yes, I get it. Yes, I get it. I get it. I get it. Or I kind of get it. Or is it like, I get it as in like, shut up and like, I'll do what I want and we'll talk about it tomorrow. And facial expression and how you look at someone in the eye or through the eye or the camera, as the case may be, is another signal. And I know that. So for me, the hard thing was the moment where I told these guys, and even put it in writing in our Notion, which was, I was like, wow, this is a new low. And I was like, I'm going to request that you turn on your cameras unless you have a good reason. And I hated that I did that because it feels so micromanaging in so many ways, but I really needed it.
Yeah, it's the moment where you feel a bit like the head teacher who's like having to crack the whip, isn't it?
You're like, I failed at building a culture where like we want to be with one another, right? It's they want to turn it off, and I'm like, no, I need to make sure that you're fully engaged and present, and not just like playing video games, which I didn't particularly think that we're playing video games while we were on these meetings, but it felt like a little bit of a failure on my part to have to use authority rather than have that happen organically. But
that's interesting though, because that's I think particularly millennial and generation, we're in this mindset that the boss has to be loved and the company has to be loved, and authority is unnecessary because people love their work at all times and want to do what's best at all times, maybe. And that's maybe a bit,
maybe I'm a soft and
a bit
squishy,
too high a bar.
maybe I'm soft and squishy.
Place.
No, I mean, I think you're right. I think there is definitely a generational thing with how an older generation would not hang up on it the way I did. But I hung up on it because I was like, this is really necessary because there's so many points of unknowns to building
Mm.
that product and that team at that stage, that if there's any sort of way to strengthen um, the ability to know that we're all staring at the right thing in the same direction and are walking the same path, like I need to take every little thing that's available. And it might have hurt my managerial sensibilities, but I mean, using authority at times is all you got. Like I'm not
Yeah.
going to shy from this. I have in fact used the words "do as I say," but it is not. It's not great when you have to do that. It's
Yeah.
different, right, to do this after you've had someone try something or do something wrong 5 times, when you had provided some path that you felt was successful, would be successful. They somehow decided to go to their own path. It's very different to then be like the 5th time around, be like, do as I say, whatever it is that you're doing, stop it, do my thing. Maybe I'll fail, but at least we'll move on.
Mm.
It's a little bit different, I think, when it's something so just cultural as like, please turn on your camera, which is not
Yeah.
a hard edged thing.
But it's
Um,
interesting what you were saying, because you I think you used the word unknowns, right, and uncertainty, which is integral to starting a new business, right? But right now, there's even more of that, because I mean, the future is very hard to know, and I think that's been the main struggle for me for the past year and a half. Is just really hard to project yourself into,
yeah,
even 2022 and beyond. And you're working with people that you've never met. Uh, there's just all these added layers of uncertainty. So anything that you can control, anything that can make things just a little bit easier in work and life, why complicate your life even more? Like, there's enough of that already, right?
yeah. It's definitely the distance, the distance, which is both cultural. I am French originally, just like Isabelle,
Just like me.
and just like Isabelle, I may have spent some time in an English speaking country for a while. And I'm also American now, but that's a recent development. And um, but it's, while I'm very comfortable going from an American culture to a European culture, and even actually European work culture was an adjustment for me the few years that I did experience it. Still, these are cultures that I don't think I'm going to sort of, I don't want to say offend, but that I have a read on, with all the variables that are down to the individual, right? People's preferences and styles and personal histories. So I don't have a problem going to an American and being like, turn on your camera. What the hell? Because the worst thing that happens is that they'll be like, no, and here's why. So that's fine. And I feel the same way about someone who might be in Western Europe. But I think when you're working with folks who come from environments and have cultures that you only know in a much more superficial way, those are exactly the things that become, you're like, well, what am I actually asking them? Like, it feels like I'm just asking them to turn on the camera. It can't be that much. But I don't actually know this. I don't know what this stands for. I don't know how they feel about me seeing them in their home environment, because again, they're not at the office. I, you know, is their mom in the background? Is their kid in the background, but in a way that they would not want for me to see their kids? So that adds to, I think, a self-consciousness of making these requests of people that you don't know well, and don't really have a good sort of pathway to knowing that well. And the uncertainty is, what am I not getting? Or what is this company not getting if we are not as fully present and as fully engaged as we could be? Because documentation will only go so far. And me, sharing all the slides and the things to try and sort of convey to, in this case, very technical group of people, what the business goals might be, or what the user goals might be, that gets me so far, but it does not necessarily create the kind of alignment that in many ways you hope you create, right, at a company where though you have a specialist of marketing that he or she understands what the product actually does and he or she understands kind of how we build it, not in details, but kind of how we build it and understand the sell pricing of it or something. And so even with a brand new company that's 2 minutes and a half old, you have to, I think, really prioritize as a manager, as a leader, that you are allowing everybody, even in their own sort of specialty area, to connect with what this is meant to do and what this is meant to achieve for the users that you're building for and for the business.
Mm.
The distance of it means that you throw it out, but you don't know how it lands. I
Yeah.
just don't know, and that's something to reckon with.
Hmm. That's that's where, when I was growing an international team or a global team, that's where travel came into play, which obviously is the problem now. It's building a remote team where people on 4 continents, but I always, when people were asking me for their advice on building a team like this, I always said, don't think you're doing this to save money, because you're going to need a massive travel budget, because that, I believe to this day, and that's where I think, I love that people are advocating for remote, and it's great, and it's opening up a lot of opportunities for a lot of people who couldn't necessarily physically be where the work is. But there's nothing like in-person connection and FaceTime, even
For
where you're
sure.
not, doing the actual work, but just to be able to know one another as people, and to in how we work, right? How we operate, how we communicate, what makes
Yeah,
us tick, and things like that. Um, what I'm
absolutely.
really what I'm really curious about is and Lauren Rosavi, with whom I've done a couple live streams on topics like this, talks about the difference between remote work and genuinely distributed work, which is what your team is, right? Because nobody is remote from a central location.
Correct.
Everyone is all over the
It's
place.
distributed.
And
Yeah,
in a way, remote, we've got a, couple decades of experience. And I mean, people were doing that long before the pandemic. But
yeah.
distributed is the really new thing, and the really challenging thing. And I'm wondering if there is a way to, instead of trying to recreate the things that were great about how we worked before, um, like culture and all of that, is there a different way of working that we just haven't imagined yet? And sort of advantages to this particular way of working that we should lean on, rather than keep to trying to recreate something that will only ever be a pale imitation? And does it become a world that's more task focused, and where you don't spend forever, trying to be mates with the people that you're working with? I don't know. I This is
But
completely
I
open
think the
ended.
question is fascinating. I would bristle a little bit at the notion that the goal of culture is to be mates, because
Right. This is a bad
the reason
shortcut.
I want to make sure that even if someone is an engineer with responsibilities for engineering, that they're connecting with a product problem, with a business problem, is because it will make them a stronger engineer, because there will be sort of things that they'll encounter as they're taking on whichever sort of piece of the machine that we're building, that they'll be sort of faced with like three possible options for doing something. And because they actually understand what the trajectory is for this product or this company, that they'll be like, actually, then road three is the best one. The other two will be problematic for this reason. If not now, or it'll be problematic in 2 minutes. So the the difference, though, I think it's really interesting that you point this out just after mentioning travel.
Mm,
The um, complexity of the distributed team is compounded by our cultural differences.
mm,
If for instance I was working with all Americans or all French engineers, I do think that those early challenges of making sure like that I can read between the lines of, are we getting this? Are we connecting on this? Do we see eye to eye? I would read that better because I would come from that same cultural world.
Mm.
And if it weren't the case, but we could travel, I'd be like, well, let me just fly over to wherever. We'll connect as humans for a little bit. And so I'll become real to them and they'll become real to me, where I kind of get other dimensions of their personality that I'm going to store in a corner of my mind and that help me read them when the going gets tough. Because so for me, I think a place where it becomes really obvious, right, is how an American team responds to your bad ideas as their manager is very different than
Mm.
how it's received in other countries. And I mentioned I had worked with offshore teams before in the context of remote. They were remote. We were in New York. This team handled certain aspects of what we were building, um, and that was that. And we would, say send them some requirements to build something or fix something, and then you'd hear back days after, and was like, okay, so I did this, but it was really difficult for XYZ reason, and but this is how I did it anyway, and you're kind of given back something like that's really convoluted and crazy, and you realize the reason it's convoluted and crazy is not because these guys don't know what they're doing. They do. It's because you wrote entirely stupid requirements or something that had a hole in it the size of Texas, that in an environment where the culture is a little bit more horizontal, that engineer, so if I had given the exact same ticket to an equally skilled American engineer that would have taken this ticket, read it for an hour, and then right back to me and said, are you really sure? Because there's something really dumb in what you just wrote, or there's a big part that's missing. And sure, I can do what you asked for, but it really sounds ill-conceived. So maybe you want to take another look. And that's what I expect, right? Like, save me from myself. Like not everything that I conceive of is genius. Sometimes it's wrong, like actually wrong. And so I've been surprised the few times that this has happened, that like the way that my brief was received was, she asked for this, we're going to do what she asked for in a way that did not, that I'm sure these guys were like, this is really wonky, not really advisable, but the client said. And so that dimension, I think you can only bridge if the culture of someone, like how they're taught to respond to authority or
Mm.
respond to just what work relationships look like, or client to vendor. If you come from a place that has fairly different rules for how we think of this versus how we think of it in America or in Europe, I do think I can probably get through to you. I'm not going to turn you tomorrow into, a big mouthed American who is going to just take a look at that ticket and be like, it's obviously dumb. Ariane, what are you thinking? Like, I get that this is a journey, but it is easier to imagine that we might get to a place with someone whose natural inclination would be to say, absolutely, we will do exactly what you asked for. Um, if we've managed to connect in person, if we've broken bread, if we
Mm.
have created a personal connection where they felt secure in the fact that not everything that they might say that might diverge from yes would be held against them.
Yeah.
Um,
This this brings up many things. Most of my, my all of my managing experience was at LinkedIn, and these were topics that were discussed and thought about a lot internally, from the CEO on down. And what you're bringing up is essentially that diverse teams are harder to make work. They're better in that they bring a lot of different perspectives that make your product better, that, you know, make you think about all your different kinds of users better. They're also just simply more challenging because you don't have that shorthand that you would have with someone from the exact same culture. Um, one, two things. One very short one. One advice that the former CEO of LinkedIn, Jeff Weiner, who was CEO when I was there, said that I thought was really helpful was because he had noticed, you know, even within the same culture, when you have someone who's like kind of that, you know, revered leader that no one dares question, which certainly Jeff was in many way, you know, you say something that you think is just a comment in passing, and 2 weeks later you realize that you've entirely derailed the work of a team because they've taken that for an instruction and they've just gone in that completely different direction. And he was like, you know, anything that you say as a leader, you know, when you get to the point that what you know, you reach a point in leadership that all of a sudden you realize that what you say has a weight that you just didn't expect.
Mm,
And so it was to qualify everything that you say with, forget how you put it, was like, you know, this is a mandate versus this is a
mm,
think about this versus this is just one man's opinion and you can completely disregard
right.
it. I'm just, you know,
Tag everything you
talking.
say.
Yeah, and
Apply,
exactly.
apply
You
your
just have to
tag.
tag it all with a level of, you
Yeah,
know, is this actually, you know, I'm your boss, I'm telling you, do as I say, as you were saying
yeah.
earlier, or
It's a
is this
very
just, you know, I'm thinking out loud, what if this, you know, what if that? Because otherwise, yeah, you might, you know, you might have the team just take one word that you said and just run with it, and 2 weeks later you're like, oh wait, but that's not the roadmap. What are you doing?
as someone who builds CMSs, I appreciate that it's like no, you need a parameter so that you can write a whole logical sequence that is different.
Exactly.
If tag equals just mouthing off here, then okay.
Yes, that's the code version. The other thing that you brought up, and I actually brought it here because I knew this was going to come up, is this book that I just absolutely adore, which is, I don't know if you can see, The Culture Map by Aaron Meyer, who, ironically, also recommended by the CEO of LinkedIn. The CEO of Netflix recommended it to the CEO of LinkedIn, who then recommended it to his direct reports, who then, and so then they just kind of spread like a wildfire. So I think pretty much everyone in Silicon Valley has read this by now. And I've been recommending it left and right. And in fact, she ended up co-writing her next book with the CEO of Netflix. So I think he's got stock in this or something. But it's a fascinating book. She's Erin Meyer. She's a professor at INSEAD, the management school in Paris, and she's looking at how to manage and lead and communicate across different cultures. And she's got like this 8 different criteria, like scale, where you place each country on each of those criteria to get kind of a map of how people uh, behave, communicate, etc. in this country. And what is interesting is that it is relative. So it's not Americans are like this, French people are like that, Indians are like this. It's how Indians are compared with Americans and
Mm,
Americans compared with Indian. And so the criteria, I'm going to have to read this, but the criteria are like communicating, so low context versus high context. So it's like how much kind of between the line you have to read. Evaluating, so direct negative feedback versus indirect negative feedback. Persuading, if your principles first versus like applications first, so more concrete. Leading, egalitarian versus hierarchical, as you were just talking about. Deciding, consensual versus top down. Trusting, task based versus relationship based. Disagreeing, confrontational versus avoids confrontation. And scheduling, linear time versus flexible time. AKA
mm.
how late do you show up to Zoom? And I found that fascinating because when I was leading a global team, like I was like, oh, that's what it was. And there was a couple pages there about how French people write emails that I literally like scanned and sent to my French team members, being like, this is why Americans never read your emails, guys. So yeah, I think a lot of this comes down to um, at least like you're not going to change how people are, but at least understanding how
Yeah.
they work really helps.
But I
Um,
think that within this, right? the personal connection you've created is the adjustment variable to leading someone who made either naturally or culturally, and it's hard to tell the difference, not sort of, you know, feel super comfortable telling you, well, are you really sure about this? Or it seems to me that we really should do something else,
Mm.
that they will kind of break their own natural limits because you've managed to kind of get to a place of trust with them and connection with them, that they feel this is safe, which a lot of also kind of good, I think, team culture is safety, ultimately.
Mm.
Safety of saying when you don't understand, and safety to say you didn't agree, or safety to propose even when it seems that a decision's already been made, which is not quite like saying I won't do it, right? That's a
Yeah.
different thing, but it was something I even saw when I worked in France. In my career, I worked only at American company. I went to school in America, and then I worked for American companies for in France for a few years, and then that American company, well, that was New York Times, sent me back to New York, where I spent many years, and then much later, 16 years into my career, in fact, no, 17 years. Wow, I worked for a French company with French people in French for the first time, which
Mm.
was
I'm sorry.
no, it was. I wanted that
No, I'm just
adventure,
kidding.
and it was
It's
very
hard.
interesting. It was very interesting to see what was easy and also what was hard. Just as a, and I thought like this is very much a sidebar, but like many times I was like, I need to write a book about this. What it means to go home in a country that is both yours, but in so many ways has become not yours, and where, as far as one aspect of culture, which is to say work culture in this case, is completely foreign to you. Because I've never worked in a French environment, and I didn't even study in France. So I, as a professional, and like all my professional culture is only American at that point. And so the reason I mention this is that um, the way that I understood how my French teams related to me was, I I realized over time, and sometimes after some really hard lessons that were not delivered in a way that I would say were sort of pleasant for me to learn, but useful certainly, um, was the amount of how people would quietly disagree, quietly,
Mm.
or
Yeah.
not understand where you were coming from, and instead of American style raising their hand and being like, run more time because I don't really get what this is, which I'm fully prepared to do at all times, that they would more like sit with it, and that this sort of like lack of having been able to bring them over to what I was trying to do translated into disagreement,
Hmm.
which which I didn't understand for quite some time. And so the reason I say this is that I think you want a culture that whose first sort of achievement, when it starts to gel and starts to happen, you don't like build culture as culture, right? Is the ability to say the words, I don't understand, I don't agree, I propose that we do X. Has anyone thought about Y? I think if all team members, whether they are most junior all the way to your executive team, equally feel like they have access to these words without risking something,
Yeah.
um, then you have the making of solving for many other problems that you could not address until somebody is able to use the words I don't understand, or I don't agree, or I don't see why X. Right? All other problems are like tumbled in the ability to kind of air that out.
Yeah. And there you have national culture. You also have industry culture, corporate
Yeah.
culture. So it was definitely something that that was probably, yeah, as well, my main battle when onboarding and hiring and onboarding new people, within our culture at LinkedIn. And um, I got to calling it newsroom PTSD. because in in traditional, we hired a lot of, and I have nothing but love for newsrooms, who are my other home. But in traditional legacy media culture, things are far more hierarchical. And then in tech, which is probably the most flat, American tech versus French legacy media, or Australian or whatever other legacy media. And people just really weren't used to exactly what you were saying, with the safety of raising your hand and saying, hey, what if we did it this way instead? Or, hey, I don't understand what's going on. Or, hey, I think there's a mistake here. And it's really dangerous when people don't, it's dangerous for the company, because things end up, wrong things go through because nobody dared raise their hands, right?
Yeah.
And it's not safe for people. But getting people into that mindset of, hey, not only is it okay, but in fact I expect you to, and we'll have a problem if you don't. That takes months, post onboarding, of constantly repeating, this is safe, this, and demonstrating, this is safe,
But the
this is safe,
remoteness
this is
actually
safe.
makes that time longer. It's
Mm-hmm.
like, had I been, was this happening with a brand new team, but also we did have physical uh, kind of moments where we met. There's so much that you get. I'm sure that there's some biologists, anthropologists, or whatever that has studied stuff like this, of just like how we feel safe just from the impression that somebody gives physically. Like, I never thought of myself as being particularly intimidating, for instance, and I've been told that I am. And I would argue that I'm probably more intimidating on a screen than when I'm just like half ridiculous. I won't say at a bar, but it doesn't have to involve an adult beverage. And you're like, no, this person is, that's fine. You can,
You know what it is. On screen, for me, what it is, and I've noticed it on Zoom because I was doing Zooms for years, pre-pandemic. Is they called resting bitch face, which I 100%
oh,
have. And I've taught myself,
no.
as you can tell, I've taught myself to smile, to have a smiling resting face, because literally that's my intimidating, unapproachable face on Zooms.
Yeah,
Which is
yeah,
entirely just how my face muscles work, but you know how it is, and for women, obviously, it's even
yeah.
worse.
For women, it's deadly.
We just, so it's like, hi.
But that the resting bitch face thing is not a real life thing.
No, it's a Zoom thing. It's a
It's a,
it's a screen
I
thing.
mean, that's
Yeah.
not true. I guess there are people, like, you go to a real meeting and there's always like that, like, frowny person that you've never met,
It doesn't
and you're
strike
just
you the
like,
same way.
this
It doesn't.
person seemed really unhappy the whole entire time, and then you meet them at some point and you're like,
Mm.
no, actually, they're this is just whatever.
But if it's in
So
a meeting, you can have a coffee right after and you're fine,
yeah,
right? Even if
yeah,
you got a wrong impression during
absolutely,
the meeting.
yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
There's a lot that the coffee cup break. It really is kind of fascinating, I think, to see what it is that we do miss in this kind of like extremely large social experiment that we're all kind of living in. I mean, not talking about folks who actually are working in stores and real life locations, but at least for white collar workers, there was always a fantasy of like, do we really need all this? And it's like, in a number of ways, you don't need all this, but you do need some of this. And I really also see the difference between like how I connected with my team at Taboola, where I was, from the very beginning, the job was, they actually tried to get me to move to LA for that job, and I said, I would love to take this job, but I don't want to move to LA. That's when we made the deal that I would spend a week a month in LA and the rest of the time in New York. So from the very beginning, I was never. It's not like I like spent 6 months in LA and then moved to New York, and so you have this remote satellite that was
Mm.
once a part of you. But the fact that we did have a week a month where I was physically in the office, where we would prioritize doing certain types of activities that were more like whiteboarding stuff or the kind of stuff that is more in conversation than in 1 hour or 30-minute sort of windows or documentation based, really meant that you could coast the remaining 3 weeks on the strength of the report that you were building that 1 week out. And there's something also when you tell people like, I don't know what this is, but we'll talk about it next week when I'm here. So
Mm.
you don't, end up having to kind of take on a problem that you recognize, whether you know why you recognize it that way or whether it's just more instinctual, that you're like, that is not a conversation we should be having over Zoom. This is a thing that we should have a whiteboard for. And then if it goes badly, I will buy the team lunch, you know, and that's how you solve for it.
Yeah. Yeah,
Um,
no, 100%. I spent it's, my boss was in New York. We had a wonderful relationship, and I never worked in New York. I never lived in New York, but it feels like I did because I was there so often, because that was the condition. That was like, you have to be there, and that 1 week would just pump me up, refocus me, remotivate me for the next
yeah,
whatever, 2 months before I went back, because there was, there's the knowledge, and there's something about the energy, right, that you just do not absorb other people's energy through
you
a
don't
computer
absorb
screen.
exactly. You
But
don't.
but is there? I feel like we've been talking a lot about how terrible it all is, but have you
It's
found benefits?
yeah. I
What's
mean,
been
yes,
good?
of course. Of course, it always sounds like, wow, this is just some whiny story. It's not a whiny story because in many other ways, the fact that you can, Helio did not exist, not even a year ago. Um, and we did build a multi-tenant, multi-site SaaS CMS in that it doesn't do all the things that I have a vision for it to do, and it doesn't serve the users in all the ways that I want for Helio to support them with. But when I think about going from zero to where we are, and now I'm raising seed and all that, it did happen in an incredibly small amount of time. And thinking about what you get on the other hand from these non-lean environments that offices are by their nature. Like offices have a lot of cruft associated with them, right? Just it might be fun cruft, but it's still cruft. Uh, I think wow, it's definitely been something that has been enabled by the fact that we could bring people in, hire from a much larger pool of people, do just this little project. I mentioned how I hired the first engineer who worked with me on Helio, which is how I like to recruit people if I can in the context of remote, which is to lurk. One day the cops are gonna come for me, but like I'll join like all the Facebook groups and LinkedIn groups and the whatever, and just sit quietly and observe the conversation until someone who seems interesting says something. And then I creep on the internet, follow them home to a more respected, just find their LinkedIn, their blogs, their whatever, run the little GitHub secret script that finds their email, which is always a little bit on the sketchy side, and then send them an email and
Mm,
say,
I'm interested in that.
oh yeah, well, there's the trick. That I'm sure GitHub is going to plug at one point, but anyway. And so when you send an email to someone and you're like, hey, we were both part of like whatever group, you were making this point. This is really how I think about this, and I checked out your profile on LinkedIn or whatever, and would you perchance be interested in joining me and working on this project with me? The reason why this is a strategy that's even viable is that I'm not adding physical location as a variable, right? If Helio was only operating out of New York City, um, most of these conversations could never happen because I would see in 1 second, well, but it's based in whatever place. The fact that I don't have to kind of use that as a filter makes that strategy of very kind of affinity driven, let people kind of self-identify as being passionate about a problem or being an expert of this particular technology or issue, and then that's it. That was the only thing that really mattered, was how passionate they would be, and or how competent they might be. The rest then becomes, are they interested in working with me on Helio, and maybe they already have 5 jobs, right? So those variables I can't were always going to be true, but that strategy is, to me, one of the best ways to hire folks in a it's fairly low overhead, because the sort of way in which I warm up to them is not contrived. It's,
Mm.
just, oh, you made that point and it really resonated, and let's chat. So
Yeah. That's
that's because it's remote. I could not do this that way if it weren't. I would do meetups, right? Like that's what meetups are for in many ways. But the first filter of the meetup is location. You have to be in a place in order to go to the meetup.
so knowing all that in to conclude our conversation, I realize we're coming up on the hour. Um, in an alternate universe where COVID-19 is just a bunch of weird letters that nobody understands, and you can work in an office, you can do everything the way they've always been done. Would Helio be an office-based,
Hmm.
locally based startup, or would you go
Hmm.
for that hybrid for that distributed model? Sorry.
I think a lot of really, really, really young incubated company, because there is a question, just a financial question of how much runway you might have, and it's usually much less than you wish you had. That naturally just makes you want to say, how much do I really need to pay WeWork for a space, and how capital efficient would it be to at least do some of the development, whether you're a software company or something else, but with a distributed workforce in markets that don't have quite the per hour rate of New York or San Francisco. Doesn't mean that it's everybody, and it doesn't mean that it's forever. And I think you have to kind of be strategic in your mind about like what you could forever do as a distributed workforce, and what would ideally sort of move back to a center of gravity for the company. And I understand that some companies really have figured out, like I know a few, how to run everything distributed forever. I don't know if I know how to articulate for myself how I would do this, like long term, because I come from a corporate world, yes, with a significant amount of remote teams, etc. But still, I think there is a part of my brain that thinks having an anchor in the world does provide for certain benefits, that I can see now, but even before, I would say they're meaningful. So if I was a betting woman, which in fact, to build a startup, you have to be a betting woman, is what I've realized in the past few months. It's all bets. I would say that the kind of more mature Helio will probably have more of a distributed workforce than what I would have conceived of had little Helio been born in 2019, in 2018. I
Mm.
think I would feel more comfortable now today, like pushing the envelope much further with having a significant part of the company be distributed and kind of remaining distributed, and we work to build a culture that makes that healthy and fruitful, rather than only think of distributed workforce as being like the early stage of Helio, but as soon as we can bring all that to a single point in the world, we would. I think now I would push that envelope much farther.
Great.
I've even investigated stuff that I was like, whoa, like, aren't you protecting yourself to like your 5-year anniversary? But I was like looking at like, how does one spin off like subsidiaries in certain countries, and then I was like, I have more immediate problems to solve than this, which which also feels like at that point you're 200 people or whatever, so most likely it's not you doing this, it's someone who's actually good at doing this who would do it. But I went down a Google search path where I was just curious about just how exactly does one do this. So
Well, it's good. It's as you know, as we said earlier, it's hard to protect yourself in the future at the moment, but it's always a good thing to
sure.
do and look forward to what the world might look like. Past the storm. Thank you so much. This was a fun conversation.
Thank you so much for having me.
Me back to my management, my hiring days as well. Maybe one day for borderline. We'll we'll get there.
I hope that you get there in 2 minutes and then have all the cultural problems.
I'm enjoying solo. I'm enjoying building my culture
It
with
is.
myself. It's a lot easier.
It's a trade, right? But
It is a trade. There's I have to wear a lot of hats, but it's good for now. Tell us just a little bit about Helio if people are curious about it, if they want to.
aha.
I don't think they can sign up yet as
No, they
beta
can.
users. They
They
can.
can sort of, yeah. Yeah, Helio is in alpha, so you can sign up if we make sure that you are the right creator. So Helio, I like that we do this. Now we're in. Helio.cloud is the website, and there is a sign up for alpha, which has like 3 fields. And it is a publishing and monetization platform for experienced creators. So folks who might create um, blog posts, newsletters, courses, podcasts, videos, in whatever channel we might be talking about, including their own, and whose monetization might be across different models, right? Like you're doing ad rev share with YouTube, but you also want to have a subscription for something, or you're trying to do partnership for something else. Generally speaking, we think that wherever the creators get to a stage where they do several things, it becomes a lot harder to make as much money as they could ever. Ever an
Amen.
important question, and also do it in a way that's sane and scalable, so that you're not doing a lot of things 5 times because you're trying to ship something to this platform and this platform and this platform. So we're trying to solve for this. And yeah, if someone is recognizing themselves and some of the struggle that they have, and I have a this and I have a that and I have 3 different tools I use, and I can't live like this, then they should sign up for the alpha, and I will reach back to them, um, and see how we can launch them.
Awesome. So that's helio.cloud. Helio like the sun.
Helio like the
HELIO.
sun. HELIO.cloud. So you see what I did here.
Clever. Clever. I like it.
Uh,
All right. Well, much success to Helio and to you. Look forward to seeing it take over the world of creators.
the sun and the cloud. We're starting. We're
The
starting there.
sun and
Then
the
we'll
cloud, and
we'll
then
go
the
bigger.
earth
Yeah.
eventually. All right.
Thank
Thank
you so
you
much.
so much.
Take care. Bye.